all distinguished participants, welcome. This is a very select group. The numbers are not small because there was no interest. The numbers are small because only a small group was invited. It's slightly unbalanced, the number sitting up there, but I understand that's because one or two have to leave early. We're very glad to welcome you here on behalf of the Centre for Policy Development, the Melbourne School of Government and the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute. As usual, I'd like to begin with the welcome to country. It's important that we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this event is taking place, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay respect to their elders past and present and to their families. It's my pleasure to chair this event. I'm John Langmore. I work at the Melbourne School of Government. I was previously in the Australian Parliament and a director at the UN, and now I'm greatly enjoying being here. This event came about fortuitously. In recent months, Travis McLeod, the new CEO of the Centre for Policy Development, who is sitting here, has been busy canvassing many people to identify key long-term policy challenges and levers for change in Australia, and discount rates came up quite often in those discussions. At the same time, Pascal Lamy made plans to visit Australia, not long after flagging the importance of discount rates in the Oxford Martin Commission report, Now for the Long Term, copies of which are available for everyone who would like one as we leave, if you haven't already read it. But even if you have, you might like to take a printed copy. The Centre for Policy Development saw the opportunity to bring the world to Australia and hopefully to send back insights to the rest of the world through Pascal. So I thank Travis and Laura Eadie for highly efficiently preparing for tonight's seminar. There's a slide up there somewhere that we're just about to see, which describes what discount rates are. And since it's written in front of you, I think I won't repeat it. And I think one or two of the speakers will explain in a bit more detail what they are in a moment. We're very fortunate tonight to have a diverse panel to explore several questions, such as what implicit judgments do governments make in selecting discount rates? Are discount rates actually in use today too high or too low, or about right? How might discount rates need to change to support long-term decision-making? The only thing I want to say of a mechanical kind is that there's a toilet across the foyer there, if anyone wants to go there, and that we're not following Chatham House rules. We're doing a recording of the event, and if anyone is uneasy about being recorded or photographed, would you please let the Melbourne School of Government or the Centre for Policy Development know. So it's now a great pleasure to introduce our four highly distinguished speakers. Mr. Lamy was, of course, famous for being Director General of the World Trade Organisation for 2 terms, from 2005 to 2013. Before that, he had several very important positions in the European Union, and since leaving the World Trade Organisation, one of the most important things that he's done is chair the preparation of the Martin Commission report, now for the long term. He's, of course, active in a range of other things, and I think he probably won't mind if I don't go through the list. Ross Garnaut has been a professorial research fellow in economics at the University of Melbourne since 2008. Before that, he was Distinguished Professor of Economics at the Australian National University. He's author of many books and monographs and articles, the two most recent being The Great Crash of 2008 and Dog Days Australia After the Boom. Sir Rod Eddington is a very famous name in Australia and, of course, in Britain also. He was, for a while, chair of British Airways, and earlier than that with Cathay Pacific, when he returned to Australia, where he won the Rhodes Scholarship from Western Australia much earlier in his life. He has had many important positions. He's now the non-executive chairman of JP Morgan. He was the inaugural chair of Infrastructure Australia, and he holds quite a number of non-executive directorships in companies like 21st Century Fox, China Light and Power Holdings, and John Swire and Sons. And he's active in various community organisations like chairing the Victorian Major Events Company in Melbourne. Laura Eadie is the Research Director for Sustainable Economy Program at the Centre for Policy Development. Laura is the University of Technology Sydney Business School Associate and has qualifications in environmental management, finance, investment and industrial chemistry. I could say a lot more about all of them, but I think I don't think it would just take up time. Each of the speakers will speak for 10 minutes. Then the panel will ask questions or make comments to each other, and after about 40 minutes there'll be open discussion. So can I ask first, please, Pascal Lamy to speak.
Well, thanks very much, and what I will do shortly is to frame how this question of discount rates came in the discussions of the Oxford-Martin Commission, and why did we put attention on discount rates among the 15 recommendations that the members of the Commission have selected as deserving more public or private attention in order to be able to cope a bit better than what we've done so far with a number of future challenges. What the Commission did was first, and that's quite ordinary, try and identify a number of megatrends in a number of global areas. We then translated these megatrends into a number of challenges: demographics, inequalities, environment sustainability, spread of diseases. I mean, I won't give you the whole list. But that's something which has been done quite frequently. The CIA does it reasonably well, as General Electric or Shell or Nestle. Where the Commission did a bit more an original work was in looking at how roughly 10 issues of this nature in the recent decades. Why did it work? Why did HIV/AIDS work reasonably well? Why did the ozone layer question work reasonably well? And on the other side, why did other issues did pretty poorly, whether it's ocean overfishing or financial regulation before 2008, or for that matter, climate change. And so we used the Oxford-Martin resources, which have a specificity which is to be totally interdisciplinary, to provide us with a sort of a clinical, analytical material answering the question, why did what work, and why did what not work. And we draw a number of lessons from that, which are the sort of real thrust of the findings of the Commission. And building on these lessons, we made a number of suggestions of a very pragmatic nature. We don't address each and every megatrend or challenge we've identified, because that would have been sort of taken too much time, and we didn't intend to be exhaustive. But based on our findings, we suggested 15 specific recommendations, On climate change, for instance, we suggest to establish what we call C20-30-40, which is a coalition by 20 countries, the big emitters, 30 big multinationals, 40 big mega cities. The understanding among the Commission being that if this coalition, the bits of which, by the way, exist, there is a coalition of multinationals working on the environment. There is a coalition of big cities working on this issue, which was initiated by Bloomberg some years ago. There is a sort of G20, as we know. So the idea would be if such a coalition agrees on what has to be done in order to mitigate climate change, then the rest of the system will align. We suggest, for instance, that we create a sort of a World Statistical Organization with using IT resources and the cloud to create a big data bank without having to enter into a sort of, treaties which statisticians have to agree in order to gather their data. We suggest for instance, that international organizations should all be given a specific sort of tenure-like rendezvous point so that their mandates, their resources, their focus will be reviewed by the ones that created it, which of course did a bit of flux in diplomatic circles. I won't name all these 15 recommendations. One of them has to do with discount rates, which is not surprising. As you just mentioned, this concept, this tool, is used by many, including governments, to take decisions where you have to weight the present versus the future and the other way around. Now, we had a long discussion about this in the Commission, starting from a sort of factual evidence that whether you look at private sector or whether you look at government, the range of discount rates which are used is pretty wide. And in the discussions we had, it appeared quite rapidly that a number of these issues, which have to be dealt with collectively, are very hard to address if you have such a difference in discount rates. Roughly speaking, if I take the two extremes, the discount rate which the Indian government uses to select sort of public investment project is around 12%. The discount rate which the US Environment Agency uses for its own purposes is around 2%. China is somewhere between 8 and 9%. Germany is somewhere between 3 and 4%. So this very wide range is representative of a wide range of preferences for long-term versus short-term, and we all know that the lower the discount rate, the higher the preference for the future, and the other way around. This led us to suggestions by some in the Commission that we should, as part of our set of recommendations, we should suggest one discount rate, sort of global discount rate, which would be the one. The point being that we could not agree on this global discount rate after quite a bit of discussion and research and attempts. That wasn't possible. And so we left it not aside, because we all believed it was an important question, but we sent a sort of joint signal that the lower the better. And this is, of course, very coherent with this idea that you have to pay more attention to long term, again, for the reasons I don't have time to describe, and which we should find in the report. This being true, by the way, both for public entities and for private entities. And we know that both public entities and private entities are under, and I think this is now conventional wisdom, so too much pressure for short term, whether it's your quarterly results, whether it's the next election. We all know, at least we Europeans, this famous say by Jean-Claude Juncker during the economic crisis, who said, we all know what to do, but we don't know how to be re-elected if we do it, which is a way of expressing this pressure on short term. So that's where we are. Now, going back to the bigger picture of the Commission, some of the 15 recommendations we made have gotten some traction in the market. And that was the idea. We outlined the recommendation, and then we'll see whether some of them have a market attention. Among those who the report was issued in October, we are nearing, if I understand well, you have the number, sort of, I think, 1 million downloads worldwide. I was in Rwanda last week. I checked the number. The Oxford Martin report was downloaded 549 times in Rwanda, which, again, is a sort of interesting example of how IT is used to disseminate this sort of way. So among the suggestions that got traction so far is the one on C20, 30, 40 I mentioned, the World Stat I mentioned, one initiative which we call Fit Cities, which is an alliance of big megapoles on non-communicable diseases, which we see as one of the major health problems ahead of us. And a fourth one, which is getting some traction, is also the last one, which has to do with establishing a sort of platform of values, which would go further in trying to frame a common understanding, a scale between good and bad, than the sort of general things which we have in the international system, including the UN system, with the Declaration of Human Rights and the sort of covenants to that. So those are the four which have so far attracted attention. What does that mean? That means that if there is enough sort of market buy-in, then the Oxford Martin people set up a sort of a stream so that this issue can be dug, that we can sort of gather enough of a coalition, again, between public entities, business, academics. So that's the way forward for what so far has, let's say, got attention. This is the first time we are discussing in public after the issuing of the report this issue of discount rates. If there is sort of enough attention to that, if the feeling grows that something else that would build on the signal we've given is useful, I'm sure I, as the chair of the Commission, and the Oxford Martin people, who now have taken the sort of follow-up to this report very seriously, we welcome further work on that, and maybe we can build on this during the discussion tonight.
Thank you very much. If you'd like to, or you, Laura, like to ask a question, make a comment?
I think I'm the least likely in. It's here, full range. Right. We can go.
Well, earlier this evening, Helen Sullivan asked if I would explain why discount rates matter, and I'll do that with two stories. A few years ago, I addressed a meeting of the Economic Society in Sydney, organised young economists, and the idea was to talk to them about careers in economics, the various things that you could do. And I was having a drink with them afterwards, and a few of them you were around me and I was asking where they were working, it happened that three who were standing talking there were from the New South Wales Treasury. And I said, well, what are you working on? They said, like, transport planning and analysis. And I said, what discount rate are you applying on the cost-benefit analysis? They said 8% in real terms. And I said, well, I can tell you now the answer to every question you're working on. There's no transport project in New South Wales that's economic. And they all said, yes, that's and I said, the consequence of that is that Sydney will grind to a halt. And there'll be no economy worth having here in half a century's time. And they said, well, sometimes we worry about that too. The other anecdote, in the second of my climate change reviews for the multi-party committee on climate change, I began the first page, for those of you who've read it, for those who haven't, telling the story of the first meeting of the multi-party parliamentary committee, chaired by the Prime Minister, and she'd asked me just to outline the issues that they would have to think about. And so a little way into it, I mentioned the discount rate, and I could see all the eyes glaze over. But I wasn't going to be deterred by that. That's a very important thing. And I went a little bit further. And I said, if you use the discount rate that equities markets apply in discounting the future, then you'll decide, the rational thing will be for you to decide not to do nothing about climate change, even if it leads to the extinction of the species, the human species, in half a century's time. Now that all brought them to attention, and Julia Gillard broke into a grin and said, you've got us there, Ross. That's the first decision of our committee. We're against the extinction of the species. And why it matters so much for transport planning and for climate change is that if you're applying the sort of discount rates that businesses listed on the stock exchange will use in business investment evaluation around 8% per annum, then anything that happens in 4 decades' time is not worth thinking about. It's at 7.2% per annum. Anything that happens in 4 decades' time is worth 12.5 cents in the dollar. And if it happens in 5 decades' time, it's worth 6.25 cents in the dollar. That was 100 years' time. It's not a cent in the dollar. It just doesn't appear in the calculations. And this is of huge practical importance in all of the public policy decisions that involve investment, where the consequences are felt sometime into the future. In my first review on climate change for all the state premiers, all the states and territories and the Commonwealth, when Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister, I spent a fair bit of time working and then writing about this issue, and the range of opinion that's sometimes put forward as the right discount rate to apply is roughly the range that Pascal was just referred to. You do have some people saying we should use equity market type discount rates. And then you have another view that I must say is the majority view amongst people who think from first principles in the economics profession, as Mixtern's view, that you should build up a social discount rate from several elements. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But just to dwell for a moment on the consequences of the choice. If you use a 7% discount rate, which Nordhaus at Yale has used in his very important path-breaking modelling of the costs and benefits of mitigation, he wrote the first serious books about the economics of climate change back in the early 90s, and he thinks that you should use a well, in his latest book, he's actually used a discount rate of 4%, so it's sort of compromised without there being a very good reason for picking a number in the middle. But that's what Nordhaus has done in his most recent book. If you work logically through fairly standard and average sort of assumptions about the costs of low emissions technology and how they'll change over time, and a sort of standard IPCC type of analysis of the costs of unmitigated climate change, then you come to the conclusion that it's not worth having very ambitious climate mitigation goals. You wouldn't, for example, seek to limit the increase in temperature to 2 degrees. You would go for something like 3 degrees, which would mean you can increase the concentrations of emissions in the atmosphere by 1.5 times from pre-industrial levels. And working through the implications of that for a carbon price, you put a carbon price on now he works in the price of carbon, comes to $30. Convert that to carbon dioxide, and it's about $10. So that's one limit. If you take the use a discount rate at the lower end of the range of possibilities, 1 to 2 degrees, that leads you quite straightforwardly to a 2-degree objective or something tighter than that, and a carbon price at the moment of about $40 and rising over time at the interest rate. So the practical implications of this are very large, although when European carbon price in US dollars is about $7.50, $8, and the Australian government is trying to reduce ours to 0, then one can say that there's unanimous professional support, at least for going to Nordhaus's position of $10, and then we can talk about how much further we need to go. Well, what should we be thinking about in choosing the appropriate discount rate? And I don't think the issue is very different when you're talking about whether to put in a transport grid like Hoddle in Melbourne put in 130 years ago, laying out the design of a city that costs quite a lot more than just letting the bullet tracks go where they want to go, and which won't generate a return for half a century, but leaves a lovely city in 2014 until we do other things to ruin it. But if Hoddle and the premiers of the second half of the 19th century had adopted a market interest rate, we would not have anything like the city that we have today. Thank goodness they didn't. What should we be looking at? Well, the reason some people argue for a market discount rate is that they think that you can invest, if you don't invest in climate change, you can invest in equities, for example, and then that will accumulate at a certain rate, and sometime in the future you'll have a very large sum of money that you can use to do something about climate change at that date. So they think that the rate at which the equities markets convert value now into value in the future is that equities interest rate. I think there's a logical problem in taking that interest rate and applying it to any of the sorts of problems that we're looking at, the transport problem or the climate change problem or any other big public investment problem. And the logical problem is that if that money wasn't spent on a railway from the east to the west of Melbourne or on mitigating climate change, it wouldn't all be invested in equities markets. Now, a proportion of it would, probably rather a small proportion of it would, and a general equilibrium model, a standard economic model that actually looks how income that's generated in one period of time is used in another period of time, can take that all into account. It's actually implicit in the modelling that I did on climate change. That there is a 4%, which actually is the long-term average rate of return on business investment when you take into account all of the players. I've embodied that 4% discount rate in that proportion of expenditure on climate change mitigation that would be actually invested in business investment. But it's certainly not logical, I think, to evaluate two states of nature, one in which you've invested to mitigate climate change, and one in which you haven't, so you end up with two different future worlds. I think it's illogical to apply that business discount rate in comparing the value of one of those worlds with another. I don't think you can avoid evaluating those two futures by reference to some more fundamental valuation of human welfare at different periods of time. Well, if we're trying to do that, how should we do it? And there are fairly standard ways. We need to, if we're investing something now, asking today's people living today to make sacrifices for better lives in the future, whether we're talking about Hoddle's plan for Melbourne or a new railway or climate change, we need to take account of only three considerations, really. One is the possibility of extinction of a species, coming back to that. If an asteroid hits us, then it would be a terrible pity to have wasted a few $1 billion on climate change mitigation now and not have a future generation. Well, Nick Stern and I both allowed for that, allowing very small possibility, 1 in 200 chance that an asteroid hits us before we blow ourselves up before we get the benefits of mitigation. The second thing you've got to think about is pure time preference. Is there any reason to value the welfare, the lives of people living now more highly than people in the future? Now, instinctively, certainly a lot of people trained in economics, but I think a lot of other people tend to do that. Part of it is the political discounting, the short time horizons of political decisions, the short time horizons of business investment decisions. But when you ask people to really think fundamentally about how they value things that happen in the future and today, certainly they don't value at 1 cent in the dollar the welfare of people who are living in 100 years' time. And when you ask most people my age whether they value the welfare of their children, the lives that they will live as much as they value their own, very few people will say they don't value the welfare of their children much or less. And if you ask those same old people whether they value their grandchildren's welfare as much as their children, nearly everyone says, well, of course we value our grandchildren more than our children. But say they only valued them the same, then there's a link that links us to every future generation of humanity. There's no reason to think that our grandchildren will value their grandchildren's welfare any less than their own. And so that link of just a normal human feeling going forward in generations takes away any reason for us valuing things that happen in future any less than things that happen today, simply because they're in the future. Now, there is a third reason why you might want to discount the future, and that is people who live in future may be richer than we are today. Now, amongst Australians and amongst members of humanity, we do generally, if asked to reflect on it, think that we should value $1 in the hands of a poor person more highly than $1 in the value of a rich person. And so if we can expect continually rising living standards for all people, then that's a reason to value consumption today more highly than consumption, $1 worth of consumption in 100 years' time. Well, how much more highly? Well, first we have to actually have good reasons to think that future generations will be richer than they are today. If you were asking this question to the kids who grew up with Jesus Christ, there'd be no reason to think that future generations will be richer than past generations, because there hadn't been that much change in the fundamental standard of living since the building of the Mesopotamian civilization. And there wasn't that much change in per capita incomes from the time of Jesus Christ until the 17th century, 0.1% per annum, something very small. But if you ask people today, we've become accustomed to this ever-rising standard of living, per capita productivity, essentially because of what's happened since the Industrial Revolution, with continually rising incomes in one after another country. And there is some reason to think that that will continue in future, but we have to be a little bit careful about it. There is just a chance that the standard of living of ordinary Australians in the September quarter of 2011 will be the highest standard of living of ordinary Australians this century, at the height of the resources boom. Certainly the standard of living of ordinary American workers and their families today is lower than it was a generation ago. So Gordon's famous paper published in the National Bureau of NBER series 2 years ago raised a fundamental question of whether the countries at the frontier, he's thinking mainly of the United States, the frontier of economic development, have ended a period of productivity growth. But if productivity growth is going to resume in the West, and it hasn't been there this century on average, and if a reasonable proportion of that is going to go to ordinary people, which it hasn't in the United States in the last generation, then ordinary people will have some rights and living standards. How much should we discount for that? A lot of the economic literature points towards using a, can't avoid a technical term, the income elasticity of utility of one, that if you double income, then double average income, then you will halve per capita valuation of a dollar of income. Now, if in my modelling, I assume that there be some continuity between average increases in living standards in the past in Australia in the future, and so I used a number, I just imposed on the model of growth in incomes of 1.4% per annum per person. Now, it comes out of the arithmetic of marginal elasticity substitution of income and utility. That would lead you to a discount rate of 1.4%. If you went to an extreme, which is suggested by Nordhaus when he discusses these things, and an elasticity of 2, then you'd use a discount rate of 2.8%. But if you're talking about these fundamental questions of distribution between generations on the basis of different valuation of income, you're talking about a range of 1 to 2 in the developed countries. Might be higher in poor developing countries. They may, for good reasons, value the future less highly than the present because people are very poor at the moment. And that's why, to persuade them to participate in a global mitigation effort, we may have to take some of the costs off them of the initial adjustment. Otherwise, from their calculation, they won't see a very good reason for making much sacrifice now. Well, even if if you're persuaded that these fundamental questions, philosophical questions about valuing welfare of people now and the future aren't really relevant. The market reflects what people actually feel. if you take that view, then there's a question of what's an appropriate market discount rate. And thinking about this for the climate change review, I ended up coming to the view that the discount rate used by business and investment or in equity markets is actually irrelevant. We're talking here about social decisions of a government, and it seems to me that the right discount rate to use in a country that's managed its affairs reasonably well to stay creditworthy, and you manage your finances reasonably well to stay creditworthy so that you will have access to international markets, and the long-term average rate of long-term borrowing for Australian sovereign governments, the Commonwealth government, is 2.1%. The average long-term rate of borrowing for the United States government is about 2%. Lower in Germany in the post-war period, very high for a while before that in Germany. But you end up with numbers around that 2%, and that led me in dog days to my suggestions for Australian decision-making on public transport to facilitate state government and, where appropriate, private use of the government's sovereign discount rate and also access to sovereign credit for part of the public expenditure associated with implementation of long-term transport planning that meets Infrastructure Australia, Rod Eddington's assessment of high priority.
Well, thank you very much for that. Absolutely excellent survey of the subject, Ross. So,
Thanks. In a sense, I'll follow on from the two previous excellent presentations, because I've been particularly interested in trying to help governments and the private sector understand some of the issues around infrastructure, particularly hard infrastructure. Recognising that governments, particularly in Western liberal democracies, are finding that the draw on the public purse from social infrastructure, the important elements of social infrastructure, health, education, welfare, particularly, grow in some areas quite quickly and grow more quickly than GDP, and therefore the amount of capital which governments have been prepared to commit over the last decade to some of the hard infrastructure areas has been limited. And there have been a couple of consequences to that. One is that governments look where they can to the private sector to drive infrastructure, and I for one don't believe that government should be in the business of owning airlines or airports. I think they're things that the private sector can do perfectly adequately. But I'm not one to believe that the privatisation of the Army, the Navy and the Air Force would necessarily be a good thing. So I recognise there are some really important areas in hard infrastructure where the government, the state, should be at the heart of the process, not just the planning process and deciding what gets done, but also in helping form and formulate the analytical strategy that sits behind, because governments are increasingly having to make choices about which particular pieces of the infrastructure jigsaw they invest in. And in doing that, they need the right analytical tools. And Ross has spoken very eloquently about some of the shortcomings of applying the sort of discount rates that private individuals and private sector might apply to equity investment, which I think have little or no relevance, as you do, to the important decisions around whether or not you invest in public transport infrastructure that will live at least for 100 years. I mean, much of the infrastructure that makes Melbourne the most livable city in the world was built 100 years ago. And the good infrastructure is as productive today, if not more so, than it's ever been. So clearly there are substantial differences between the way in which the private sector would look at things and the public sector would look at things. We know that building infrastructure, particularly in successful cities like Melbourne, is both expensive and disruptive. So the question then is, what analytical tools do governments and the private sector use to help formulate their priorities? And in a world in which there are constraints around capital and construction availability, it's important to get your priorities right. and it's important that the analytical process should help you do that. And this is an area where I think economists like Ross and his peer group have actually made a substantial contribution to the discussion. Nick Stern, who did some of the work on climate change in the UK, was someone who I used extensively when I was doing a report for the British government on the links between transport and the economy, because he brought the rigour that Ross brings to the discussion around how the decision-making process should take place. And that's something that's evolved. So, for example, economists talk about agglomeration benefits, the benefits that come from co-locating a lot of different activities in one place. Typically, one of the reasons why cities can be productive in the service industry is we have the co-location of financial services, legal service, education services, the seat of government. We have great universities and great businesses side by side. And the first tangible example I saw of agglomeration benefits being factored into the analysis of a substantial transport project was in London, when the Crossrail project, which was a major rail initiative in London, had as part of its analysis the benefits of agglomeration. So I think this is an evolving issue, and I think we're getting smarter about the way in which we apply analytical techniques to help us in the decision-making process. And I think this is an area where the academic establishment can make a real contribution to the practitioners and the government's view. I have to say, and as John said, Infrastructure Australia began about 6 years ago, and I have to say that I think the thinking that's going on now in government and federal agencies around these issues much improved. The fact that they would have the sort of discussion they had with Ross, those three young people from New South Wales Treasury, and when you asked them about discount rate, they said 8%, and you said, well, you'd never build a railway line in a million years if the discount rate was 8%. And is not building a railway line the right solution? The answer is absolutely not. The question about which railway line and when you build it's another matter. So I think there's been a substantial improvement in the way in which both the private sector and the public sector look at these issues, because they think much more clearly about the issues, including about issues around discount rate, than they did, and that's a thoroughly good thing. Just as well, because the alternative to a rational analysis, and when governments reflect and the private sector, but particularly governments invest in hard infrastructure that's going to have a long life, they don't just think about economics. They think about community and sustainability as well. And obviously one of the things we try and do is to quantify these benefits, and Ross has talked and written eloquently in print as well about how you might attack the issue of climate change through an economist's quantitative eyes as well as through a qualitative set of values. So governments do reflect on community, they do reflect on sustainability, but at the heart of that analysis is a real understanding of the economic benefits of investment and also the consequences of no investment. And that means, amongst other things, that we have to quantify the cost of congestion, whether it's congestion on the roads or in the air, or whether it's inadequate electricity supplies, whether it's congestion in our water grids. What is the cost of congestion? And as Ross has said, you know, if you make a certain set of assumptions, you'd never invest, for instance, in climate mitigation technologies because they'll never pay you back, but we'll all be out of life and out of a job in 50 or 60 years' time. So I'm interested in the analytical techniques, and I'm interested in applying them to real situations to help governments make the right decision. Because absent quantitative measures, political leadership will make judgments around what they see as political priorities. And that can mean building bridges over puddles and roads to nowhere in marginal electorates at election time. And the economic disbenefits of that are real. So I think one of the things I've tried to do is to try and help those who are in the debate build a set of assessment tools which take away some of those political influences and try and ground the discussion in rational debate and rational analysis.
Thank you very much for that discussion of the way things actually happen. Laura, you might like to go straight ahead.
Thanks, John. Look, there are very few people who understand discount rates and long-term investment, as well as the three panellists who are here with me today. But for the past 3 years, I've been lucky enough to be thinking about how Australia maintains and builds competitive advantage in a world where we have carbon constraints and increasing resource price volatility. So I hope that qualifies me to comment to some extent, to say something useful about long-term discount rates. My aim tonight really is to convince you that discount rates are central to a discussion of the future trajectory of the world economy and to growth. Discount rates really stop being a boring thing you should know about, and they become a leverage point for how the global economy evolves when we move on, as I hope we are, from the debates about whether 1%, 2% or 5% is fair, and start to look at how they actually influence who invests in what. So I'm going to touch on 3 points tonight. First of all, where the debate on discount rates is heading internationally. Secondly, what bumpy growth implies for discount rates, for productive investment, and I'll touch on sustainability. And third, what that implies for public policy. But before I get into that, I just want to dig a little bit into social versus market discount rates, which I think Ross outlined quite expertly. I'm going to talk tonight mostly about social discount rates, and when I think about this, I like to imagine a benevolent dictator, kind of picture the fat controller from Thomas the Tank Engine, who's managing an optimal growth path to get the entire world economy to some notional future steady state, but along the way to maximise all of our welfare. And that's not just, us here today, but it's children and grandchildren. So the fat controller's job is to increase welfare by saving and investing, if and only if the returns are at least equal to his target increase in consumption. So in technical terms, that means that the discount rate or the opportunity cost of capital is endogenous. It's set by that target rate of growth of consumption within the economy, and that itself depends upon how the fat controller decides we invest in stocks of capital, how we accumulate capital over time. Now that contrasts very distinctly with the investment approach, which would set a discount rate as notionally risk-free or risk-adjusted rate of investment by reference to a market. But we all know that we don't live in perfect markets. So the market rate of return on investments, if you've got any imperfections at all, is just simply not equal to that social or consumption rate of discount. I'd also note that we don't have perfect policies, so we can't really price the difference between private and social costs and benefits and then go and apply a market discount rate. We don't know whether carbon price should be $7, $40 or $100. One other thing I just want to mention as a sort of caveat here is that we also don't really know what drives growth. So, our growth path is inherently uncertain. Economics has been referred to as a discipline that has physics envy, but on one account, the two are the same. They're both still searching for a grand unified theory of everything. What we do know increasingly is that high levels of connectivity within the economy means risks or shocks are transferred faster and further. And once you've got one risk, shock is likely to set off others. So you see high levels of correlation between risks or shocks. For example, a sudden jump in inflation can impact consumption growth just through reductions in real wages. And if you then get slow growth, you have low real interest rates, capital markets, may not direct money to productive investments that will then lead growth to pick up in the future. So that's just a little bit by way of background. I said I'd talk about where the debate's heading. Well, we have seen a really big academic debate about how to consider the welfare of future versus current generations, and I put a formula up on the screen there, which I think Ross outlined very well. Most of that debate has referred to the pure time rate of preference and the elasticity of marginal utility of consumption. And that's really focusing on the weighting between generations and the social transfer between rich and poor. But I don't believe anybody's really yet started to debate the growth term. So you can see that third term, the G with a little T below it. So that's our assumption about the growth rate of per capita consumption between now and the year T. There has been a little bit of discussion starting up around that precautionary term down the end. So there have been extensions to this model in which people have looked at what happens if that growth is uncertain. Uncertainty of growth raises the question of how the discount rate then might change over time. And the answer that people are landing on is that it's actually wise to use a declining discount rate over time in the face of uncertainty about future growth. So you might start with 8% today if you're in, I think somebody mentioned India, 8%, or 12, I'm not quite sure, and then scale that down over, say, a 40 or 50-year period to reflect the uncertainty about what discount rate will be in the future. There are a couple of factors at play here, but essentially, if growth is looking uncertain, then the payoff from investing now to avoid future declines in welfare will be higher. So you should use a lower discount rate further out in time. That might sound counterintuitive if you have had anything to do with the investment approach to discounting. My husband said to me, he's an accountant, he said, but don't you raise the discount rate to account for higher risk? And I think the distinction to make here is that there's a real difference between risk in the financial sense, which is volatility of returns around a relatively assumed growth path, and uncertainty about the continuity of that growth. So let's swap the fat controller for a CEO for a moment. If you assume that the CEO is planning to keep the company running for the long term, they essentially have to decide what proportion of earnings they're going to reinvest to drive growth. This is something that most people who are involved in any business management would be pretty familiar with, versus what you pay out as dividends. If you're running that company and consumer demand starts looking uncertain or your brand value starts declining, you wouldn't question that it makes sense to invest now in new products or marketing so that you're in a strong position in, say, 5, 10 years' time. So it's the same sort of concept that we're talking about here with keeping an economy on track and making sure that we maintain welfare. So turning to my second point, bumpy growth. A lot of people have been asking, are we entering a new normal? I think we've heard people talking about the Anthropocene. I think economists made that quite a famous term. But the world is definitely going through a lot of change. And after a couple of decades of relatively low volatility in business cycles, others have written at length and much better than I could explain how monetary policy and structural economic change have actually contributed to that low volatility, and about why that moderation may seem to have ended. To my mind, we also need to think about significant changes to the physical basis of the global economy that may mean we see even more bumpy growth or volatility in the future. Some of these are structural, so shift in the geographic centre of growth to Asia, increasingly integrated supply chains, new energy technologies disrupting old economies. Others could be considered perhaps more external drivers of volatility and change. So we're all very familiar with the debate around ageing populations being a drag on growth. Commodity price volatility, I think it's tripled in the last 15 years across all commodities. And then climate impacts. I don't know who this was, but Standard & Poor's recently reported that weather-related losses are up in all continents and fourfold in Asia and North America in particular. So we may already be starting to see the early impacts of climate change, and for Asia in particular that may be a factor. The Asian Development Banks just recently noted that the cost of natural disasters have exceeded increases in incomes over the past few years. So for many emerging Asian economies, those still with a high dependence on agriculture and also on liquid fuels, commodity price volatility can flow through to bumpy growth. And importantly, that bumpy growth can then be a drag on public finances. So globally, if uncertainty is the new normal, I believe we need to think in a much more sophisticated way about what investments make sense if we apply a longer focal length by using declining discount rates over time. How do we actually assess which investments raise long-term productivity and ideally also buffer against volatility? And then finally, which stocks of capital we should be looking to accumulate to best support future growth. My answer on that, by the way, is big fish, but I might come to that in questions. I'm sure there'll be a question about that one. Finally, I said I would talk about what all that means for public policy. So I just want to come back to that gap between the social discount rate and the market. And I want to propose to you that unless we do something to address that, that can lead to underinvestment, that leaves countries and perhaps even entire regions into poverty trap. What do private capital markets do when they face uncertainty? They just essentially avoid it. So banks will only generally lend for 5 years, when I think Travis and I heard the other day many energy efficiency projects need 10 years of funding. Even if the returns are certain, banks may say, no, sorry, we're just not comfortable enough, we're going to go for 5 years. And the private sector is often scared off by the uncertainty of being the first mover into a new space. So for example, investing in solar rather than diesel generators at remote mine sites is something that nobody was willing to do until government money came along to actually reduce some of that uncertainty and kick off the first project. Where the private sector does acknowledge uncertainty, the likely response is going to be to raise investment discount rates. For example, Standard & Poor's just the other day warned that climate change could impact sovereign credit ratings, particularly in Asia. They pointed out that the creditworthiness will probably be felt through various channels, including economic growth, external performance and public finances. And the corollary to that, it would cost you more to borrow money on international bond markets if you're in that situation. We also see, generally in the private sector, an ad hoc approach to raising project discount rates whenever you have uncertainty. So we know that markets alone won't direct capital. Sorry, just lost my point there. We also see at the moment that markets alone won't generally direct capital to more productive investments, even if we get real interest rates being quite low. So if we had global growth crash, interest rates come down, well, actually to where they are at the moment, you don't necessarily see anything going into productive investment. In fact, you may see what we have in Australia at the moment with low real interest rates, a boom in property prices, and potentially financial sector unanchored from the real economy. So given that, we really need to start thinking smarter about public finance. How do we create institutions or mechanisms to encourage private capital into investments with long-term benefits? And I'd cite the Clean Energy Finance Corporation there as an excellent Australian example of how that can work. And I think secondly, we need to think about building in buffering mechanisms to avoid failures in capital and insurance markets. So the Asian Development Bank recently, for example, suggested a disaster risk pool for Asia, because insurance markets aren't really touching disaster risk in Asia. Obviously, such investments need to be assessed over the long term, and we need to develop better tools for doing that. I also think they should probably, where they do interact with capital markets, while they should be assessed at a social or discount rate, or perhaps the rate at which a government can borrow, they should charge for services at market rates of capital. The idea being to crowd in rather than crowd out the private sector. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Laura, for a very lucid presentation. Do any of the panellists want to ask each other questions or make comments?
I think we've talked enough, John. Let's hear what the audience wants to talk about.
Are there questions and comments from the two? Yes, John.
My question is about the mix of investment. In a modern society, we have a private sector that invests in things where there are minimal market margins. And then you have a government sector that's investing in things where there are market failures left, right and centre. Both those sets of investments contribute to future growth and the better off of our kids and our grandkids. So my worry is, should we be using roughly the same discount rate for private investments that'll make our kids better off, and public investments that'll make our kids better off, assuming we've done all the broader benefit cost assessment. And so I think each of you have floated around that that's important, but then sort of said, well, I'll still let the corporate sector use the sky-high rate, but I want the government to use a low rate. Now, if I literally interpret the rationality of that, we would get too much investment in government-type investments and too little in private investments in terms of looking after our kids in the future. So what's wrong with my logic?
Pascal, would you like to have
I mean, the conventional answer to that is the sort of, I mean, some of you may know that, the sort of, McKinsey diagram where you have a horizontal, the profit rate, and vertical, the time to return on investment. And it's something that shows quite nicely that private is on high return short term, and public is on low return long term. And that's roughly how public systems work in global market capitalism. The problem being, of course, that this is valid as long as, for instance, you value investment in social systems like education the same way as you would value investment in setting up a mobile telephone company, which experience has shown has a high return short term. So this leads to a sort of division of labor, which is what we've had so far. But this doesn't, in my view, this doesn't solve the problem of having a sort of more collective preference on these issues. It doesn't say, it just says private sector likes short-term profit, and you need public goods which are low return long term, and that's by default for the public sector and the taxpayer. I don't think it's a very valid way of stabilizing this issue in my view.
have you got an alternative then, if you don't like that approach?
Yeah, I think the alternative, and that's roughly what we've heard from these presentations. I mean, this alternative, in my view, will not shortcut the value issue. Whatever approach you take, you cannot avoid having to qualify the well of welfare. And even if you take this Ramsey formula, a lot of the variables are value-based decisions. What you said, Ross, about future species, or the value of a dollar in the hand of a poor versus the rich, all this is totally value tainted. So the notion that there would be a sort of miracle formula of a discount rate that would avoid expressing collective preferences for things which are value-based, I think is a dead end. And that's one of the discussions we had in the open market, which is that we probably need, among different countries at global level, more of what has been tried in some countries in having a public debate about this discount rate. And take a country like Australia, for instance. I mean, seen from where I am, which is at some distance, you've had several decades of, let's say, intergenerational reports and views. I mean, they haven't always been based on how much of a discount rate should we use. That's a relative, but you've had this reasonably long-term factoring in public decision, which in my view has to do with the fact that in relative terms, your public systems have been run, let's say, reasonably rationally. And there is a link between the two. And remember this experience, which is a bit of a counterfactual, which is psychologists know. You take a sample of kids and you offer them the choice between one sweet now and two sweets later today. Now, the reaction, I don't have a precise number in mind, but it's roughly 80% of kids would say, I'll take it now, and 20% will say, I'll take to this afternoon. Now, if you follow up the educational cursus of this sample of kids, the 20% that decided for the afternoon are doing much better in their educational cursus during the 5 or 10 next years. So in a way, they are more clever by the standard which educational systems apply to decide that a kid is more clever than another kid. So there is something of rationality there. You know, it's just not just stems from ideology or philosophical preferences. There is something of rationality there, and I think that's where I would. That's the way I would sell to a larger public or to countries who, I mean, if you take Finland or Sweden or Australia, what they have in common is a relatively medium size, with a sort of sense of belonging that helps framing this sort of issue. But I would sell it without recoursing to the benevolent dictator, which may raise a few, ruffle a few feathers in some audiences, but there is something of the truth that this is a collective rational approach. And I would just, sell it this way.
I think John raises a really hard question, but and take a long time to go through all the things relevant to an answer. But the difference is not as big as it looks for a couple of reasons. Investors want a 7 or 8% return, but on average they don't get it. And the fact that Australian mining companies were after 10% real returns is why they made no investments for 15 years, and why we had a sky-high terms of trade. Export prices rose to huge levels because they were after unrealistic rates of return. And then the psychology of private business investment, right when certainly within the same year as prices reached their peak, suddenly there was a flood of investment decisions. And so prices halved for coal and iron ore. When you look at the average over long periods of time, something like 4% real return for business investment, more like, it's not what investors say they're looking for, but it's more like the real average. And then when you look at the private sector is quite diverse. That's specialised businesses, but a lot of the private investment is family businesses, investment in housing, and so on. And people there are really making choices between putting money in the bank or saving in the bank and undertaking a mortgage and superannuation funds investing on behalf of households, putting a lot of money into long-term bonds, government bonds at 2.1% long-term average rate in real terms in Australia. So the actual rate that's being generated in the private sector is somewhere between that 2% and the 4%. So we're not talking about such a big gap as might see at first sight. That's a little bit of the answer. We can keep talking about the rest.
Right, do you want to say more?
No.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm just going to...
Okay, sure.
I was just going to ask if we could put another layer on the question that was asked and put a cultural layer on it, so that you've talked about Western countries and their view of sort of how, I guess, the discount rate might look. But if you're in China, sitting from the outside and listening to what people say, there's definitely a long-term view. So they're much more prepared to really take a strategically long-term view and do things now that are going to change things for the future, which, sitting where I am, seems pretty smart. But what's your opinion there of that sort of difference in the way that cultural overlay goes to how we view the economics in terms of that. And then when it comes to the growth rate, to what extent are we stuck with a paradigm that's just got to keep going up, and it's got to have a quite significant upward trajectory, rather than maybe going back to the past, as Ross mentioned, where you had more in equilibrium maybe. Obviously, if you're in a developing country, you might not choose to see that happen, but in a Western country where we're quite comfortable, do we need to keep seeing that go up?
Ross was our ambassador to China, remember, and runs a program at ANU with some senior Chinese economists and academics, so he's eminently well placed to talk about the differences.
Yeah. Well, earlier I was talking mainly about the rates at which we should discount the future rather than the rates at which we do. There are huge variations across society in the rates at which you actually do discount the future, and it changes over time. Back earlier in the last century, 100 years ago, savings rates were much higher in Australia, America, France than in China. Mm-hmm. Savings rates are now much higher in China, so preferences on these things change over time. They're ephemeral, and I'm not sure that they reflect fundamental differences about valuation of the future, rather than decisions on whether to prefer one lolly now to two this afternoon. I think the differences are philosophically less soundly based than you might be suggesting. On the bigger question of what do we assume about long-term rates of growth and consumption, I was simply taking a positive rather than normal view. If it is the case that your consumption is going to be twice as high in 100 years' time, then that is one reason to place more value on sacrifice of consumption now than sacrifice of consumption in 100 years' time. There's some quite big questions about what will actually happen in the rich countries, much less of the question about what will happen in the poor countries unless systemic failure of some kind, environmental or political, leads to collapse of economic development in poor countries, which of course is one of the possibilities. But when I think of economic growth, I'm not just thinking of economic growth being more inputs and more outputs. And that's not what economic growth is. Economic growth is rising living standards, and you can't have rising living standards without, for example, without a larger environmental footprint, without larger use of materials, without larger amounts of polluting energy. Every technological improvements are sometimes raw material and energy saving, and sometimes they're raw material and energy using. They both generate economic growth. What you need to do is to recognise the external cost, the damage that some types of growth have, and put a price on that. And that will deter that type of growth and encourage economic growth of the other kind. I don't see any good reason why the economic growth that is manifested as medical innovation, better and longer life and healthier life, should be something we should arbitrarily deny ourselves.
Sorry, I wanted to make a comment.
Okay, all right.
Sorry, Rosemary, one flippant comment and one serious one. The flippant one first, on the culture. I also have wondered why it is that China is able to take such a long-term view. And one answer I've had from somebody is that they have a lot of engineers, so they're actually used to thinking about the economy as a physical system, and therefore have also taken climate change and, in their case, water scarcity quite seriously. On the growth question, I've also wondered for a very long time why consumption of growth is built into a lot of economic writings, and got a really good answer from somebody who explained to me that there's often in economic models there's an assumed rate of technological change that leads to unemployment effectively. So if you don't have growth of around 2.5–3%, then your 2.5–3% of assumed technological change will lead to people being unemployed, which is interesting when you think about potentially making, say, a transition to a renewable economy. You actually need to still be talking about and thinking about growth in policy settings for the period of that transition, so you have a way to smooth people's shift between employment.
You want to make your point, Pascal?
No, I mean, just to repeat that, if you look at the spectrum of discount rates used by governments, China is not on the 2% range. It's on the 8% range, which is right in the middle between the 2% and 14%, which is the highest one. So, I mean, I'm sure you're right that they have a cultural relationship to time, which is a specific one, which stems from the notion that there is some sort of flatness in time. Nothing really starts and never really ends, and it's more a question of a cycle. And I'm sure it frames the relationship. But when you look at the discount rate they use, it's a sort of normal 8% with the sort of rate of growth and level of poverty which they have. And I mean, if you look at how the range is, you got sort of India on the one side, and and again, and U.S. Environment Agency. There's nothing like a real U.S. government sort of coherent discount rate across the board. Even if my country uses a very low discount rate officially, but I don't think they really behave the way they say they should discount time. I think they have around 2%, which is in many ways great for those who have a preference for the long term, but they've had a public finance deficit for the last 40 years, which I would say is not really coherent with having a 2% discount rate.
I think, Pascal, you got me worried because I think maybe I came to the wrong place because I'd take the lolly. I'd take the one lolly now, but the more serious point, I'm interested in what sort of institutions we need to create or establish, particularly in democratic societies, to get some of this long-term stuff right. A lot of the discussion's been about, essentially values-based establishment of discount rates, and there's been some comments about politics, and politics is good at a whole lot of things, but not especially good, it seems to me, at teasing out long-term preferences, and that might be one of the reasons why your country, has a certain discount rate but actually doesn't follow the rules or follow that. Rod talked about the importance of techniques, evidence, and rigorous thinking informing decision making. And Laura talked about the fat controller, but we don't actually have a fat controller, in Australia and in countries that, like us, that we aspire to, I suppose, as well. We have democratic institutions that deal in politics, and I'm just wondering, perhaps to Pascal and perhaps to Rod, because you've been chairing an institution that tries to do this. What sort of institutions do we need to get this stuff on the agenda in the context of democratic politics?
Can I have a crack at that first? I absolutely buy the line that democracy is a pretty ordinary form of government, but it's much better than the next best alternative. So personally, I'd rather be stuck in that reality. I think what it says is we need to have the sort of discussion and dialogue I think we are beginning to have, and our academic institutions are a critical part of that. But what's also important for me is that businesses are prepared to engage in the policy debate. So as a businessman, I've always tried to stay out of the politics and stick to the policy. An evidence-based approach to decision making, and The trick is to try and get the best dialogue and narrative around that evidence-based approach. So to be open and not to be doctrinaire. So in the context of the transport work I've done, I naturally resile from a dialogue along these lines. Whatever the problem is, the answer is build a railway line. Or whatever the problem is, the answer is build a road. Or whatever the problem is, well, let's have more flights. Because my view is that one of my roles in Infrastructure Australia was to be modally agnostic. So to try and tease out the journeys and the issues, including discount rate, and then look at different modal solutions in a network context and to come up with the best recommendations. So I actually happen to think that universities have got a really important role to play in this. And to be frank, there aren't enough people in Australia like Ross. So when I did my work in the UK, I got a group who called themselves my academic friends, who were by and large transport economists, not all of them. They were economists more broadly, from a whole range of different backgrounds, and Nick Stern, as Ross knows, chaired that group for me. And I used them not only to help us think about the issues that needed to be part of the evidence-based approach, but also to pressure test our solutions. So I think it's only when a combination of business, political and academic leadership, and let's not forget the role of the civil service in this, the key administrators, are prepared to use their collective wisdom in a Socratic way to find the best approaches, will you get the best outcomes? Because the default position in a democracy is the political leaders will take the decisions, and if we don't arm them with the tools to make informed decisions, they will build bridges over puddles and roads to nowhere. And we've talked about China, let's talk about Japan, where I lived for 4 or 5 years. Japan's got itself into much worse shape than most countries here because debt's 230% of GDP at the moment. And one of the reasons public debt is so high in Japan was that they built infrastructure pretty much regardless. So I think there are 40 airports in Japan capable of taking a 747, most of which will never see a 747, some of which will see virtually no commercial traffic at all. And yet they have a pristine runway and a big terminal and all the infrastructure that goes with it. So there's a great incentive often for political leaders to take decisions and do things. The question is, will they make the right sort of decisions? And if we don't help them by arming them with the tools to make the right decisions, we can't complain that they don't take the right decisions. So I happen to think it's a challenge for democratic processes, but I'd much rather live in a democracy than anywhere else.
I think everyone wants to
we've written quite a bit on this issue in the report in another chapter, and the view of the Commission was, although we didn't, given the fact that the Chinese planning minister was part of the Commission, there was not that much development on sort of basic democratic principles, but the consensus was where you started. But the view was that independent institutions, which are public institutions and which are independent from the political cycle, are a necessity, and that where these institutions exist, it works better than when they do not exist. Not least because if they have a trust record, sort of credibility track record, their participation in public debate is of high value. I mean, Australia, you've had the Productivity Commission, for instance, for a long time, which I think is what my country used to have in the 60s with the Commissariat au Plan, what the Dutch had with this council between industry, the state and trade unions. So I think this is the right answer. And by the way, central banks have been playing this role more and more. And if there is a place in the system where there is a sort of implicit collective discount rate it's probably between central bankers, although they would, I'm sure, deny that there's anything like this, the reality. And it's striking if you look at the way businesses prepare the next generation. If you look at how Zara or Pernod Ricard or even Microsoft plans for future things which they will sell 10 years from now, the way they do it is generally establish a specific compartment in the company that reports to nobody else but the CEO, that's clustered from short-term budget profitability, and that's where they cook their long-term, let's say, in the consumer business actually, because I visited some of these operations, which are, I must say, fascinating, the way they operate, but this is clustered. This is sort of independent from the line of the company. So there's something also there in the business sector, which I think points to the same direction.
Sorry, I'll go in the question.
You didn't? Okay, Ross,
No, I have a question.
you were writing? No? Okay. Yes, Gary.
Am I willing to give it back? You promised to give it back to me?
You get 2 lollies this evening.
My question is for Sir Roy, and it's a policy question, and it follows on rather from your earlier comments. As we all know, at the end of the year, November, in Brisbane, we're going to have the G20 summit. Terribly important meeting for Australia. And one of the 4 agenda items is infrastructure.
Yep.
We have 4 B20 working groups working towards, on behalf of business, what the proposals could be. In Pascal Lamy's report, he looks for institutional reform and singles out particularly the G20 as a process that should be, I think the words, Pascal, reinvigorated. Now, as far as the infrastructure topic is concerned, and given your earlier remarks, the fact that countries have such different discount rates, as we all know, what can usefully be said by Australia in terms of infrastructure to give some sort of substance that would reinvigorate the G20 summit declaration that would come out from, or will come out from Brisbane?
There's been quite a bit of work done already for the B20 on infrastructure, and there is quite a bit in the G20 as well. I think it's extremely difficult to get a universal consensus around things like discount rates. What I think is increasingly the case, though, is that particularly the mature economies all recognise that they are approaching a point of real concern. So the issue of infrastructure is not just alive here and front page in Australia, but it's true in Europe, it's true in North America, it's true in the developing world, but in the developing world the problems are often different because the networks exist already in the developed world. It's just a question of how you make them more efficient and enhance them. Whereas in the developing world, the networks don't exist. So you have to build your road and your rail networks, you have to build your telecommunication and your electricity grids, you have to build your water treatment plants. So it's a slightly apples and oranges comparison. But there are real issues in the big economies, the mature economies, that they're having to confront. They're not just having to confront the issue of how they make decisions about future investment in infrastructure. They're having to make decisions about how they maintain existing infrastructure. So in the US, for instance, there's a clear recognition that a lot of the infrastructure networks were built 100 years ago or 50 years ago and need constant reinvestment. The maintenance bill's going up quite quickly, so they find themselves in an awkward situation where they're having to make trade-offs between investing in existing networks to keep them current and building new networks where the technology's changed. So it's quite difficult if you're comparing the developing world and the developed world, but within the developed world, many of the problems are the same. And you come back to the question of where you put your chips, where you allocate capital, and the decision-making processes by which you decide where to allocate capital. And this is the sort of debate that group is having and needs to have. It's about how you generate an enlightened, evidence-formed basis to help the decision makers make the right calls. For all countries, because the interesting thing is, we all have a vested interest, I would argue, in China's success. If the Chinese economy continues to grow and prosper, then that's terrific, not only for Australia but for Europe as well. So we actually have a vested interest. There should be no competition between countries, in my view, about comparing these sorts of issues. I mean, there are areas where countries compete with one another, but we have a vested interest in Europe making the right calls on infrastructure investment. We've got a vested interest in China making the right calls. So we should be comparing in a transparent way and sharing best practice.
I was asked recently by a senior public servant whether we might be able to help. I work in a think tank here. I'll make a plea for think tanks as well as universities.
Yes, correct.
Sorry. How we can help them come up with these types of calculations so watertight objectively that they'll be able to survive elections, sort of to, we just need something that is objectively right. And of course the problem is that there are value decisions as part of these. And so I wonder whether, and we've talked about the role of longer term institutions, whether another aspect of those institutions needs to be sort of arm's length, very credible, because one of the roles is actually to provide cover to both sides of politics, and that is essentially a confidence trick. And I mean, central banks, I guess, are the ultimate confidence trick. Money, I suppose, is the ultimate confidence trick. So they can provide cover so long as there is some level of bipartisan agreement not to problematise the value judgments that there have been in these calculations. And I just wonder what the panel thinks about that. And the other thing I'd just say about democracy, because it's quite right that these must be value decisions, and therefore it is the proper role, sort of politics in its best sense. This is its business, as it were. But presumably also democracy can evolve. Like any other human kind of institution, is there a way that we can imagine democracy getting better? I mean, yes, it's only the least worst, but can we have a slightly better least worst?
Who wants to handle this most? You'll have to have one at a time.
Well, I mean, my response to that, given that I raised the democratic issue, is informed democracy is the best. But you need, and Pascal's right, you need institutions. And Infrastructure Australia was set up by governments precisely to provide the sort of informed and hopefully independent advice that Pascal spoke to. And think tanks, I would argue, fulfil a similar role in a different way. So when I retired as Chairman of Infrastructure Australia, in my sort of retirement note, I thanked the Productivity Commission because we drew quite heavily on some of the work they did. And we also drew on the work that the think tanks did, like the Grattan Institute, and groups like the Business Council of Australia have done. So this is an issue that's getting a lot of attention, and that's a really good thing. But the thinking has to be so persuasive that the politicians can't ignore it, because you can come up with a logical dialogue about what you should do next, and a new party comes to power and they say that's not our political priority, it's that. People out there don't vote for us, so we're not going to build a railway line out there, we're going to build a road out there because those people do vote for us. I'm not talking about any particular group now, but we still see evidence that the hard-nosed analytical work is interesting and ignored because it's trumped by the political imperative. And we just have to keep pushing the evidence-based approach so that political leadership, if they choose to ignore that advice, the first question the journalist asks them is, why have you done that and not that, and what's the evidence to do that rather than that? And increasingly I think we're seeing that. It's a good thing.
Andrew, what did you want to say to me?
Oh yeah, sorry, I just wanted to comment. I have been in that situation where you're working for government service and you're asked to give an absolutely watertight answer on something. It's very difficult. The best approach I've seen to it is to set up a method of forming views around value judgments and then a process of reviewing those over time and getting the right people involved in that. So you can give the government at the time, you know, an answer that is backed by best judgment and process, but you can also change that in the future if new information comes to light or new techniques come about. And I think your second question was on institutions to help democracy evolve, right? Or improve?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because I mean, I know what things like you have to
you have to do it. Yeah.
I'm not going to do it. We don't work for a government, so
Not,
to try to be as persuasive as possible. But my point is just there are values judgments in these. And so it is the proper work of democratic politics to discuss those values judgments. That is very difficult, and we kind of we bemoan how democracy is kind of very problematic for this. And you know, in China, it seems to be that they're able to be longer term because they don't have to stand for re-election. That's a key difference. I'm not sure, you know, maybe also a cultural to time and stuff. So, but you know, we talk about democracy as though it's something that doesn't evolve, and could it evolve? And I think what's right.
I think you're absolutely right. But the experience shows that, I mean, if democracy is a system for properly aggregating individual preferences into collective preferences, which it is in sort of rational terms, then institutions of this kind can help framing these collective preferences because they provide for material which is in a way politically unbiased. Although at the end of the day, this is a value choice. But where you have a specific problem is if you move global. Because what bounds people in a democracy is the feeling that they have to take these decisions in the name of the community they feel they belong to, and they need this community to strive, to survive from time to time. There's nothing like this at global level. And global level, in a way, you have the institutions, you have the IMF, you have the World Bank, you have the OECD. The OECD, is a formidable think tank. If you look at many national issues, I mean, on education, on economics, on environment, on agriculture, the institutions are there. Even, the WTO Secretariat has sort of pretty good economists that say reasonably good things for medium and long-term contribution of, trade expansion, to growth, to inequality distribution, and so on. The problem is that you don't have anything like a global community. And the notion that the G20 is a proxy for that, I can tell you, frankly, does not work. I attended all G20 meetings when I was DG WTO, so I only missed one, which was the St. Petersburg one last year. I don't think, by the way, I missed a lot. I say that publicly. Mm-hmm. What is striking, if you sit around the G20 table, is how these people are good at, and the ones that work for them, at avoiding anything that is like a value-based discussion. That's a sort of prerequisite. Values are outside the world, the sort of stream of considerations. And I think it's a big problem. As long as they don't have a sort of proper exchange on what the scale they have in mind is, they don't, they just talk past each other.
Sorry, I do have my own pet idea on evolution of democracy. I would love to see basically a committee of ombudsmen. So a group of people who have to apply to be in a pool, like for jury duty, who are then selected at random to serve a term on an organisation that looks long term and ask questions like, what do we want our future to look like? Basically solve a vision thing.
So a team of fat controllers.
Sorry?
A team of fat controllers.
But they wouldn't know they were going to be the fat controller, so they presumably have to be less politicised.
Come on, we're running out of time, Andrew.
Andrew Walter, Melbourne School of Government. We're talking about the difficulty of reaching international agreement on discount rates, but what about in the level of society, which the discussion over the last 15 minutes or so has been revolving around? If I was placed in a state of a kind of semi-Rawlsian veil of ignorance, I might want to know something about levels of inequality within the society in which I was likely to be placed. I might also wish to know something about levels of likely income mobility in the future, that is, whether the probability of my grandchildren rising up, if I were placed in the bottom end, is high or very low, as it appears to be the case in some countries today. So the difficulty of reaching a societal agreement, even at the national level, about the appropriate discount rate, I just wonder whether this is quite a difficult question, I think, and I wonder whose discount rate we're talking about. Are we talking about the median household? Are we talking about the median voter, or someone else?
Well, we have to take a collective decision. We've taken one when the New South Wales State Government has taken one when the Treasury uses 8%, and we have no other process than a decision of governments. The decision of governments can be influenced by a democratic process, and I'd like to underline the points that Pascal and Rod have made about the contribution that can be made to that by what I, in other contexts, have called the independent centre of the polity, people who are separating themselves from vested interests who have a very particular interest in the outcome, and separating themselves from partisan political processes, but seeking to take a collective a view in some collective construction of the public interest. Now, no individual is free of private interests in thinking about that, but I think in having a discussion within an independent centre of the polity, informed by analytic units, think tanks, or of other kinds, whose job it is to analyse choice, put information into the public arena. I think you can narrow quite a lot the range of disputation, so that when in the end a political process takes a decision, it's from a narrower range of possibilities and more likely to satisfy a larger part of society's conception of the public interest.
I think we should move on to the last question from...
Oh, thanks, John, and thank you to the panellists. My question's for Rod, but feel free to jump in. I was intrigued when you said in your comments from the vantage point of Infrastructure Australia, the chairperson, that thinking within the executive government was much improved on this issue, and it sounded like something a teacher or an examiner might write on a student's paper to say something. You've been very conscientious, you're doing a lot of good thinking. I'm just wondering what you think it will take to move the dial on this issue from the hard thinking and the quantitative rigour to a lowering or sort of action on some of these issues to bring the future more into focus in thinking about investment decisions, and specifically Ross's proposal in Dog Days about using the sovereign rate of borrowing and IA beefing up its independent role. Do you support something like that?
Yeah, look, I think change never happens as quickly as you would like. I've always lived by Machiavelli's quote on change, which nothing is so difficult as trying to change the nature of things. You have as sworn enemies all those who benefit from the status quo, and as lukewarm defenders those who might benefit from the new. And so the way in which decisions have been... people have been building infrastructure for thousands of years, and they've been making judgments about what to build and what not to build and why to build it, right down to, the angle of the sun. Let's build it around a view that if we build it in this way, then the gods will be happy with us, and if we build it in that way, they won't be. It seems ridiculous now, but it was something that the Mayans and the Egyptians lived by, and they got lots of things right. So we shouldn't expect that we're going to go from a situation where decisions around these sorts of issues are taken based on political instinct and expediency to an evidence-based, thoughtful process. Everyone has to keep pushing. But for me, one of the tests about whether or not things have got better or not is not just the work that's being done by civil servants and the private sector, but the sort of questions that get asked of people when they announce a particular decision. So in the private sector, if you were to stand up as a chief executive and say, we are going to buy 10 A380s, you would be asked about why you're buying the A380 rather than the 777 and how many people you're going to put on it and what assumptions you've made about fuel burn. They would go very quickly to what I would describe as an evidence-based analytical basis. Well, I'm beginning to see politicians asked, when they announce infrastructure initiatives, the sort of questions they're asked are quite different to the questions they were asked 10 years ago, because people are beginning to apply the sort of analytical analysis that we've been talking about to the decisions that get made at political leadership levels, and that's a thoroughly good thing. So don't expect we're going to go from where we were to where I hope we will get to. And we also need to build the institutions that Pascal has talked about, and more importantly, make the best use of the institutions that already exist, including our universities. Because there is often a reservoir within our universities of people who think deeply about these things, not just within the think tanks, not just within the institutions like the OECD, and we need to value the work they do and the contribution they make to this debate.
We'll finish now, and Ross is going to sum up.
Well, I won't try to go over all that ground, but I think we've touched upon all of the important and difficult issues. Thanks, Pascal, for introducing us to the thinking within the Mountain Commission, which tremendously important that's been done at that level, and we should all make sure that we read that and make it well known. And I'm very sympathetic to the dilemma of the Mountain Commission, that you couldn't get people to agree, but at least you could agree that the lower the better, and that is right. and that is a very important step forward. We should all be challenged by John Freeman's point about how if we apply this low discount rate, and in our decisions on how many lollies and ice creams and private cars to consume, a discount rate, a different discount rate is being applied, will we end up having too few lollies and ice creams and cars? I gave the first step of an answer to John, but another part of the answer is that we can't avoid in the end a collective decision, a decision of the state in how big that lump of public investment is going to be. And it's not going to be a decision to do everything that has a positive net present value at a 2% discount rate. But it's very important that when Rod or whoever's chairing Infrastructure Australia does their evaluation, they do the evaluation on the basis of a realistic low discount rate. Now, that will, if Infrastructure Australia applying good methodology looks at enough projects, it will end up with a bigger list than the polity is going to decide to do. But I think that an important part of the public discussion about which projects to do should be the discussion of what the size of the net present value is of a range of projects at that low discount rate. I actually don't think there's a very big danger that we'll choose to do too many. There's quite big biases, at least in our society, not in the Chinese society at this moment in history, but in our society towards emphasis on private consumption. A number of people touched upon the differences in time perspective in different societies, and I added the dimension that they change over time. Pascal mentioned the high discount rates applied by Chinese government in evaluating investment decisions. That comes at the same time as the society as a whole decides to save 50% of their income for future use, which is a collective decision on saving that would make no sense at an 8% discount rate. So there's a contradiction at the heart of their decision making, and I think it would be a little bit of a story like your story in France. The National Reform and Development Commission tells all the ministries and provincial governments to apply the 8% discount rate, but a whole lot more things than that get done, which is one of China's problems at the moment. Such huge overinvestment in heavy industry and infrastructure that on the latest figures I gave a seminar at lunchtime that John came to, the most recent data says that in 2013 there's been such a decline in capital productivity that total factor productivity might have fallen to zero last year. So whatever the central government is asking everyone to apply, they're not actually applying it. But we had a very important discussion on how to make rational, how to approximate rational decision making on these long-term issues in a democracy, and it is very difficult. But I think that we're on the right track in a number of members of the panel, in fact probably all, talking about the importance of institutions that are at least there with a mission to undertake independent assessment and at least professing to make transparent evaluation in the public interest. That will always be an ideal that's only imperfectly approached in practice. But I think the ideal is very important, and I think in Australia institutions like the Productivity Commission and the Reserve Bank show the influence that having such an institution can have. They don't always get their way. Well, actually, the Reserve Bank mostly does for good and ill. Although the Treasurer has the political, or has the right, the legal right to overturn a decision of the Reserve Bank, the status of the analysis within the Reserve Bank is such that it doesn't happen. No. The Productivity Commission doesn't quite have that status, but it does significantly influence the debate. We have to look forward to the day when an Infrastructure Australia can play that sort of role, not to always determine the outcome, but at least to raise questions in a way that has a fair number of people in our society saying, why not? What's the good reason for departing from that when political leaders seek to go somewhere else? And I must say, in my recommendations on the establishment of the Climate Change Authority, I had in mind exactly that intention to build an independent institution on the contentious question of setting targets that would do the analysis, put that in the public arena, so a government could overrule it like they can overrule the Reserve Bank, but over time the hope would be to build up a standing of that public institution that would establish a political cost for not taking its advice, and of course that would be the location of thinking about the application of the discount rate to questions of climate change.
I'd like to thank Pascal for raising this issue in the Oxford Martin Commission report, for Travis and Laura in focusing on this in a very productive way, to Ross and Rod, Pascal, Laura for excellent presentations, and for everyone for participating in what's a really important, profoundly important discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you.